y dentro de un país.
Good morning. A little modern technology. I guess I should start by asking those of you that have cell phones or Blackberries to turn them off. This room is often not conducive with them being on. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Wilson Center is delighted to hold this Directors Forum with Alicia Barcena of Mexico, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Deputy Director of the Center. Lee Hamilton, our President and Director, regrets that he had previously scheduled meetings and could not be with us this morning. The Woodrow Wilson Center is the national living memorial honoring President Woodrow Wilson in providing an essential link between the worlds of ideas and public policy. The Center addresses current and future challenges facing the nation and the world. The Center promotes policy-relevant research and dialogue to increase understanding and be instrumental in enhancing the capability and knowledge of leaders, citizens, and institutions worldwide. Created by an act of Congress 41 years ago, the Woodrow Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institution supported by public and private funds. In seeking to bring a wide spectrum of people together to discuss critical issues of the day, we have the confident hope that from the dialogue on public policy issues, participants can learn from each other. Work of all can be enriched, and better understanding and better policy can emerge. Through close to 800 meetings a year and the presence of over 150 scholars during the course of a year, the Center's work and its scholarship commemorates the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. This meeting today is very much in the Wilsonian tradition, bringing together practitioners and scholars for an informed exchange on what are clearly critical issues for the entire Western Hemisphere. Alicia Barcena has had a long and distinguished career of public service. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in biology from her Mexican university and a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University. Alicia's career has included teaching, research, and writing in Mexico, as well as work for the government of Mexico. She was a founding director of the Earth Council in Costa Rica. She's had a string of impressive assignments and has served with distinction with the United Nations, including work for the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Environment Program, and prior service with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Before assuming her current position, she served as the United Nations Undersecretary for Management, a key assignment in New York. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Director. We thank you for being here. I know we will have a productive meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Not at all.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so very much for this wonderful opportunity. I'm so glad to be here. Michael, Cindy, I know that both of you were instrumental to have me here this morning, and I'm particularly grateful that the Wilson Center is dedicated to these things and also interested in Latin America. You know, we are back in town, I guess, and that's fine. I mean, as you know, in the world there are so many other things that are happening that sometimes Latin America and the Caribbean seems to be a little marginal in the political interest. But I think we have things that, particularly in ECLAC, we're thinking about after what has been happening the last year. So that's exactly what I would like to share with you, some of the new thinking that is emerging from our institution. And I know that I'm here with Cindy, which has dedicated her life actually to many of the issues in our region, and we are grateful for that indeed. So let me start by saying, what are the dilemmas and uncertainties we believe are confronting the world in terms of after this crisis? In the first place, I think there are things that we are worried about, and one of them is the old and new forms of protectionism. I guess that this is one of the things that all over the world is being not said so openly, actually. And our region has behaved more or less, I would say, conservatively in terms of protectionism. But that's not the same thing in terms of Europe and China and basically the US too. And we're talking not only about the normal forms of protection, but also the new forms, like financial, like even the carbon footprint, which is probably going to emerge as a new form of protectionism. The second issue, I guess, is what's going to happen in Pittsburgh. I mean, everybody's asking the G20 what? Is there really going to be a profound change in the financial architecture, or we are going to face only cosmetic changes? I mean, now that the IMF got the $500 billion, and that everybody's talking about recovery and this and that, it might be that the financial architecture might not change as much as we would like to. The third thing is, in connection with the G20, will there be more regulation? What that means? I mean, what type of combination of public-private policies are going to emerge internationally, regionally, nationally? The fourth thing, I guess, is bilateralism going to be in town, or is it going to be multilateralism? And I think Woodrow Wilson Institute is essential to reflect on these things because, of course, multilateralism is the preferred path, I would say, for the world. But bilateralism is what's happening now. I mean, even the world is afraid that China and the U.S. might cut some deals and leave the rest of the world out, frankly speaking, on trade, on climate change, on many other issues. And then coming to climate change, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change. The Kyoto Protocol was a market mechanism, and now the world is moving towards a different approach in Copenhagen. Many call it Hopenhagen, but I think it's not going to be that way. Anyway, but the thing is that, and we have a lot of dilemmas there. One of them is that, what are we going to do with the U.S., frankly speaking? I mean, the U.S. doesn't want to join the Kyoto Protocol. Then what? What is going to be the next, let's say, instrument, multilateral instrument? If we don't get something going there, then we might end up having unilateral measures rather than a multilateral framework. Anyway, but that's one. And then, of course, in our region in particular, unemployment, informality, and poverty, because we are facing what we call a jobless recovery, frankly. I mean, even if we are in recovery path, we are facing it without jobs. And unemployment is all over the world. But in Latin America has a very different meaning because we don't have the social protection systems that are required. And also informality is a very saturated, overwhelmed already by unemployment, traditional unemployment. And what's happening then is that informality and illegality are starting to get even more connected through the drug trafficking and things of that sort. And of course, the topic in town is fragile democracies. I mean, what are we going to do with our democracies are very fragile. I mean, we can say that our democracies are fine and that we have many years with them, but they are very fragile precisely because of the economic and social situation. So I believe that the world is going to have to think about 5 transitions. And the 5 transitions are, we, after the crisis, will have to think very carefully from moving from a market supremacy to a new role of the state. And that doesn't mean that we don't want the market, but that the world understood that the market alone is not going to solve our problems. So we have to move to a new role of the state. And of course, we are now in the new role of the state because it's the state who is acting in the crisis, whether good or bad. But that's the reality. And then the second thing is we are moving from traditional geopolitical alliances to very new political geometry. Even the BRICS, I mean, the Brazil, Russia, India, China's, of course, the alliance of the BRICS, actually, I think, is because they are handling the most 40% of the reserves in the U.S. actually, but they don't have really a lot to share. They don't have a lot in common actually, but still they are conforming a new alliance. At least Brazil, China, and India are. Not only in the economic front, but also on other fronts, climate change, peace and security. You can see that when you go to the UN and you see what's happening there, the new alliances that are being created in many fronts. And of course, China's predominance is going to be an important fact. The thing is that China is missing one thing. We believe, at least in Latin America, it's a very important partner for Latin America. But China doesn't have yet the technological strength to become a global leader. That's the issue here. But still, China is becoming more and more important. For example, in Latin America, China has come up in terms of destiny of exports. From 2000 to 2008, we just finished a report that I'm going to leave with you, which says that, for example, in the case of Mexico, China was the 25th country of destiny. Now is the 5th country of destiny in terms of export. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, China is the first destiny of export. So China is and probably is one of the few economies which is dynamic in a way. Now, the other transition is, how do we move from social exclusion to a more inclusive development? At least this is really important for our region, and I'm going to refer to this later on. And how do we move from research and development, which is very exclusive? It's exclusive for big companies, it's exclusive for the people that have access to university education and so forth. How do we make it more extensive for all? And in terms of innovation, we believe that research and development is not the same as innovation. And finally, we will have to move from an oil-based economy to a carbon-free, or at least a lower carbon economy. Now, everybody knows the short story of the crisis, so I don't think I'm going to dwell on it quite a lot, because the short story is the known links, the subprime, investment banks, financial system, crisis, confidence crisis. We know the reconfirmed link. Everybody knows that the transfer of this crisis to the real economy, there was no decoupling that people were talking about, and the proven effect is that we are facing lower economic activity, negative growth. Almost 81% of the countries are showing negative growth, drop in international trade, and foreign direct investment, reduction in remittances. So this is the short story. For our region, the short story of the crisis has impacted, at least in 4 fronts, the foreign direct investment. Look at how much it fell. It fell from, almost 10% positive to, and this year we are expecting a fall between 35 and 45%. Remittances, which is also so important for our region in social terms, we are expecting a fall between 5 and 10%. But look at that, the foreign direct investment is going to fall much more than the remittances. Look at one issue. The foreign direct investment last year was $128 billion. Remittances was $69 billion. Almost half of the capital that comes into the region comes from workers. And it's falling between 5 and 10%, which is not as much as the foreign direct investment, by the way. And commodity prices have fallen around 30%. They are now recovering. Oil and soybeans and so forth are recovering prices, but still the drop was big. And the external demand. So look at this. Now, the greatest shock in Latin America was not financial, was trade. That was the greatest shock in our region. But let me show you quickly here, foreign direct investment, as I was saying, grew. The peak of foreign direct investment was historically in 2008, and the fall is going to be almost 45%. We are expecting that at least. And if I could put the line of remittances, which I haven't, you will see that is half of the foreign direct investment comes into the region in remittances. This is exports, and you can see one very important thing in that the volume, the exports fell 31% and imports 29%. If you want to see a similar situation, and we have that historic graph that I didn't bring today, but I can certainly share with you, if we have to go 70 years ago. Exports in the region have fell like this only 70 years ago, exports. Imports, which have fallen by 29%, you have to go in history 26 back. And this is the problem. This is the greatest shock in our region, trade. And we believe that it's going to be with us for a long time. Remittances, we can see here what are the major countries that are being most affected. Ecuador and El Salvador are the greatest affected, not only because of quantity and volume, but also because they are dollar economies, so not even with depreciation of the dollar, they can compensate. So these are the 2 countries that are really very affected. But what do I want to really share with you is that we believe that the future will be different. And that is that there's going to be a new normality. Some of the academics are talking about a new normality, which means that there's going to be a lower plateau of growth, that the potential of GDP in developed countries is not going to be the same. So to recover back to the pre-crisis levels of growth is going to take a long time. So at least for the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to have a world that is going to be living under lower GDP rates. But also, this is a world that is going to, and you can see this. Look at this. If we did this comparison, and you can see that between the World War I, the Great Depression, the World War II, the faced oil crisis, and the current economic crisis, you can see how many countries are really facing a same recession simultaneously. So the problem in the world today is that 80% of the economies, almost more than 80 at least, are in negative GDPs. This is a simultaneous thing. Before this, we had the Asian crisis or the Latin American crisis, the tequila, the this, the that. But this is the first time 80% of the countries in the world are depressed. And this is really important. And also, this is something important, at least for Latin America, that there's going to be much less aggregate demand in the U.S. This is a problem. Look at comparative analysis of private consumption, which is the blue bar. Look at the private consumption in the U.S. In 1990, 2000, then we moved to 2001, 2007, which was the boom for Latin America, by the way. And then look at the world post-crisis, where we're going to have a totally depressed consumption. People are very optimistic now in town, but it's not right. This is at least what we are looking at. And also look at trade. This is the most worrisome thing, I guess, in the projections. Look at the trade bar in 2009. Look at the drop in trade. This is the worst ever. We believe in ECLAC that if we compare the Great Depression of the 29 with today, we will find out that the greatest impact and the abrupt fall has been really in trade. And you can see here that trade is falling, or is going to fall in 2009 in unprecedented ways, and also that the recovery is going to be very slow. So the world of the future is going to be faced by lower growth of GDP, lower trade. Our region is very frustrated, you know, because after a period of, I would say, 6 years or 5 years of consecutive growth, where our countries applied very solid fiscal policies, they tried to reduce the public debt, they tried to do their homework, you see, with prudent fiscal policies. And of course, there were 3 things, the first 3 bullets, that were unprecedented in Latin America, which was solid fiscal policies, improve in public debt profile, increase exchange rate flexibility, and of course this was connected to the international reserves. The region was, when they say we were better prepared, is because many countries of the region had international reserves. We ended up, let's say, 2007 with more or less $500 billion of international reserves. This was unprecedented in the region. So the region decided to save, or at least some of the countries. It's very difficult to say that all the countries in the region, and I want to make that distinction from the start, because we have a very, I would say, heterogeneous situation. But anyway, and the third element is we had a surplus in the regional current account together with economic growth. And these, of course, in turn, transform into access to external funding, and of course, increasing trade. Look how much the trade increased during this period. 138% in value, 49% in volume. This trade is now negative. It fell from 138 to minus 13%, combining exports and imports. So you can imagine how much the region is really hurt and suffering because of this. And of course, the per capita GDP grew for 3% every year for 5 consecutive years, and unemployment diminished from 11% to 7.5% with more quality of jobs, and the poverty rates fell from 44 to 34. Now, this is very important. We're talking about 37 million people got out of poverty during this period. Do you think these people want to go back to poverty? Adding up to the 150 million that we already still have in the region? Do you think these 37 million people want to go backwards because of the crisis? This is a frustration that we have. And then experience shows, and here we are showing something, that it takes double efforts to recover on the social front than on the economic front. So if we compare what happened after the 80s, you will find that in terms of poverty, which is the red line, it took us 25 years to recover the 40.5% in 1980 to come back to 2005, more or less, when we got back to 40.5, which is not good news. I mean, 40.5% is a lot of poverty. But it took us 25 years to recover from the 80s. Now look at the economic front. It took us 14 years. So it takes double time, double effort. And this is what we are transmitting to our countries. Hey guys, don't do what you did after the debt in the 80s. Don't put poverty last, because it's going to take double. And of course, the long history of the crisis, which is the one we are looking at today, is that we have this crisis of development models. I mean, of development, let's put it that way. People thought at some point that growth and development were synonymous. Well, they are not, you know. And ECLAC has been saying that for years. And we believe that the model based on segmentation and predominance of the financial sector over the productive, over the real economy, that's part of the problem. We come from a history that we were nominal in terms of recovery. We wanted to recover the nominal rates. But what about the real rates of growth? So we believe we have to start talking about again. And of course, we are under production patterns that are jeopardizing our habitability. This is an additional thing that we have going to inherit to our future generations. So we are going to inherit to our future generations a deficit, a fiscal deficit like never before. We're going to inherit a world that is going to have a less plateau of growth and trade. And we are going to inherit a very short space for using the traditional energy sources, the traditional consumption patterns. So the future is different. It's going to be very different. And of course, we cannot continue to afford globalization with high concentrations of wealth. And the two paradigms that just fell apart is the invisible hand and the trickle-down theory. Oh no, these two, we have to rethink them. And in our region, we are facing actually 5 gaps. And that's why it took me some minutes to start, because I wanted to add the 5th gap, and I couldn't, but I can tell you that. The first gap is the inequality and poverty rates. We're going to talk a little bit about that. The income distribution and social protection. The 4th is education, and I'm going to show you why. The 4th is productivity. We still have these productivity gaps. And the 5th one is the investment gap, which is a very serious gap that I'm going to show you right now. First of all, we have the privilege of being the most unequal region in the world. You know, we are not the poorest, but we are the most unequal region of the world. Look at Asia Pacific, look at Europe, look at OECD countries, then Latin America, of course, is the most unequal region of the world. Even more unequal than Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is in terms of labor and in terms of poverty. What I was telling you is that the region made some improvements in terms of poverty rates. You can see there that since 2002 to 2008, more or less, or 1999, more or less, we dropped 10 points of poverty rates, and also around 7 points in terms of extreme poverty. And of course, unemployment, it is also very linked to income distribution. That's the key link in terms of poverty rates is income and jobs. So at the moment, we are facing this year an unemployment rate in the region of 9%, more or less, which is more or less transforming into 4 million people more that are going to be out of formal employment. formal employment, which is what we can really measure. Because informality, we have a lot of difficulties to measure it. But at least 4 more million people are going to lose their formal jobs, adding up to the 15 million unemployed in our region. And the other problem is that we have a vicious circle in the life cycle of poverty in the region. People that are born poor, that cannot have education, then the lack of education translates in unemployment, informality, low productivity, and then at the end of their lifetime, they have a lack of social protection in a very increasing aging population. So, young people of this room, we are leaving you a fantastic world, because in addition, our region is going to have more old people than young people. So, for example, children of 4 years old are less people than people that have more than 80 years old. So in 2 generations, you guys will have to take care of us, the aging guys, with very poor social protection systems. So, if we have to do something here, and this is only to illustrate education gaps. Look at the blue is showing the poorest quintile, the poorest part. We divide the population into 5 quintiles. The poorest one is the first, the richest one is the fifth, and look at the differences between primary education, secondary education, tertiary education. I mean, the blue, the first quintile doesn't even have access to the tertiary education, by the way. And of course, one thing is when they go in, which is, and the other thing, look at the comparative analysis between 1990 and 2005. The region has progressed. Of course, look at the secondary education, which is key for reducing poverty gaps. You can see from 7.9 we moved to 20.5, which is very important, from 61 to 84%. So yes, the region is making a lot of progress in quantitative terms, which doesn't mean the quality is better. But anyway, but here is where we are. Look at our productivity gap. This is really worrisome. Our region went for export-led model. We wanted to be the champions of exports, but with very low productivity. That's the difference between Latin America and Asia. Asia decided to go to exports, but with innovation, with productivity. We did not. So we are exporting with very low productivity. This is the terrible gap that we have in our region. And of course, the productivity gap is also associated with the inefficiency in using energy. We are the worst region in terms of energy efficiency. For each input of productivity, we are using a lot of energy inefficiently, and of course, the gap is growing. So what's happening is we have an energy intensity path. Look at OECD, which is the pink line, with a blue line. So, I mean, people say, okay, if we were more productive, it doesn't matter if we are more energy intensive. But we are not productive and we are using energy wrong. So something has to be done. And the technological frontier. Look at this. I mean, just an indicator, no? Which is patents. You say patents in English, right? Patentes. Mm-hmm. So these are the patents. So while the US is upfront in biotechnology, Japan, the European Union, Canada, Korea, China. Look at Brazil, is the only one that appears in the percentages. The rest don't. I mean, it's so small that we don't even want to put this here. But this is the patents, just as an indicator. There are many other things happening, but we are very far from being part of the technological frontier. Look at Korea, China, India, Japan. So that's a different story, right? And this is the investment gap I was talking about, that many people don't talk about this, but this is essential. We have not been able to recover our levels of investment, 23% during the 70s, during the famous decade of industrialization. Remember that this famous decade of Prebisch, no? Where there were very active, productive policies. We in ECLAC, look at where we are now, 18%. We still haven't been able even to go back to the 50s. This is the greatest problem in Latin America and the Caribbean, investment. And investment on productive sectors. And this is, for us, a very essential thing. We are not suggesting by no means to go back to the decade of the 70s industrialization, no. But we are certainly proposing to have active policies of productivity. You may remember one of my compatriots, very sadly said, President, said that the best productive policy is the one that doesn't exist. Hey, well, no, we believe the opposite. Because this crisis brought forward these weaknesses that we have in Latin America. And the weaknesses are that we are based on industries that extract natural resources with no innovation and with very little international competitiveness, maquilas and so forth. Our countries are trying hard to recover from the crisis and to respond to the crisis, but still these responses are very erratic, if I may say, because they are, of course, many of them are making enormous effort on the monetary front, which is the green part of the bars. The red one shows the fiscal policy measures. The blue one shows you the foreign trade measures. The pink ones are targeted policies to housing and agriculture, and the orange ones are related to labor and social policy. And we have a detailed study, by the way. We did a matrix comparing the responses of the countries of the region, including Canada and the US. So I think this would be interesting for you to see what countries are really doing. But look at the frustration of Latin America. Please just look at this. We have here that the twin deficits, which is current account balances and fiscal balances, that it costed all years to get from 2002, 2003, 2006. We were in the best, ¿cómo se dice? Cuadrante, in the ¿cómo se llama? En el más importante, hey, how do you say it? In the graph. Exactly. The quadrant, you know, the most auspicious one, which is the bottom left, the upper left, the upper right, the upper right. So that's when our twin surpluses were at their best. And look how quickly we went back to where we started. And this is very frustrating. This is what I'm talking about. I mean, we were better prepared? Yes. Better prepared for what? That's the next question. But anyway, now, this is where we come to the new role of the state. And here is where ECLAC is working very hard to see if we can work on a pre-analytical framework to make sure that our region, we can help the countries of our region to see if they can rethink their agenda, their development agenda, with a new fiscal policy, a new covenant, a new social covenant. That's what we are trying to bring back to the table. Because let me put you the example of Mexico. Mexico, which is the worst of the worst, which is now on negative growth of 7% this year. The fall of Mexico is terrible. But also, Mexico has only an 11% fiscal burden percentage of GDP. 11%. With that percentage, you can't do anything, you know. So anyway, and then how do we choose the right mix of public policies? How do we search a more proactive relation with the market, but with clear views from the state? How do we protect the most vulnerable sectors? And how do we ensure the spread out of technology innovation, fostering at the same time a green economy? So our main highlight is that we have to go to a new fiscal covenant that has to move to equality. Equality. A right-based equality. Is the equality, you have the right to be part of a system. Not because you have more, not because you earn more, not because you contribute more. We are suggesting to go back to the main equality lessons. From assistance-based, I mean, we believe that cash transfer programs are wonderful, but they are assistance-based programs. We need to go to a universality in terms of access. And tax reform based on efficiency and progressiveness. This is how the Latin America is obtaining the fiscal revenue. Look at Brazil, which is the one that is capturing the greatest, let's say, tax revenues. Look at Guatemala, which is at the very long end to the other side. And of course, the composition of this fiscal revenue is also something that we need to look into. And the majority of our policies are regressive. Why are they regressive? Because after the state intervention, the Gini coefficient is worse. You see? I mean, in Europe, probably the inequality is at some point, and when the state intervenes, it gets better. Now, in the region, it gets worse. So, I mean, something is wrong. So let me end by saying that we believe that politics is back, not only the state. Why do we believe politics is back? Because to have a good state policy, you need state policies, which means continuity. You don't need a set of policies for the current government of Bachelet, 4 years. You don't need current policies for Calderón, 6 years. We need state policies, long-term state policies, regardless of who is the leader of a country. But our leaders think that they have to stay themselves. You know what I mean? I mean, hello. No, I mean, the thing has to be the opposite. That is, we need state policy. The guy could go. I mean, there's no problem. But we need the institutions. No. And what we need back is a state that is worried about the provision of public goods, not the ownership of public goods. This is the problem. We have to go back to the basics. Musgrave and Buchanan, great Nobel Prize of the U.S., he very clearly said the state is about the provision of public goods, but the property of the public goods might be from the private sector, no problem. But the state has to guarantee that they are there. And the public goods are very much linked to universal social protection, to innovation, we believe, productive convergence, energy efficiency, cut back the carbon emissions, and the regional and sub-regional integration beyond trade. We confused the integration in our region with trade for many years. No, we need a vision of integration which is not necessarily trade. Thank you very much. I hope I gave you some provocative thoughts, and we can share anything through the debate. Thank you so very much.
You want to do the question?
Okay, we have time for some questions for Alicia. We ask you to please wait for the microphone and then identify yourself. You can make a comment, but please keep it brief. And what we'll do is take several questions at a time and then allow Alicia a chance to respond. Okay. I see you, John, in the back. Go ahead.
I'm John Sewell. I'm a senior scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I thought it was a marvelous presentation, and I hope that Cindy makes the PowerPoint available to all of us. You know, everybody has looked to ECLA for extremely interesting ideas over at least 4 or 5 decades by now. And you've laid out a very interesting agenda, which I think is right on mark. But you're left with the feeling of, okay, you're right. Talk about the politics of actually achieving that within individual countries and its relationship to sustaining democracies, which you started out with, because none of these tasks are easy. And it seems to me that Latin America has a major challenge to it, but it also needs responsiveness from the outside, from the international system. If you could talk a little bit about that, it would be very interesting, or at least tell us where you've written it.
Right here? Sure.
I'm Maria Ivanova. I'm a fellow now here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And Alicia, I know you're an environmentalist at heart. And I heard the green economy there sneak into your presentation very briefly. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because this was perhaps the most positive presentation on the current economic crisis that I've heard, of how we could take the crisis, understanding what the issues are and turning them into opportunities. And if we were to focus on the green agenda and the green economy as a vehicle for Latin America to come back and be integrated into the global economy, how would you approach that? And I'd like also to echo the previous question about the international system, given the fundamental changes in the economic and political landscape, I would ask the question you asked in the beginning: what should happen to the UN? You asked what should happen to the US in the climate arena. If we were to take that climate arena and ask what should happen to the UN and the role of Latin America within that. Thank you.
I'm going to put one additional question on the table. Both of the last two questions had something to do with the international community, and I want to ask about regional governments. To what extent do you think that there is a consensus among governments in the region about the need to move towards greater progressivity and efficiency in tax collection? This has been an agenda for a long time, and yet there are very few countries that have been willing to take this on in a sustained way that sometimes implies conflict with the private sector. So if this is a fundamental aspect of Sewell's agenda now, what sort of echo do you hear among the governments in the region?
Shall I go ahead?
Alicia, those three questions are asking you to give another speech.
That's right. In the first question, John asked about the, what you're asking really is the role between politics and the fragile democracies, right? Now, I think that one of the things that, at least in ECLAC, we want to make sure is that, from our perspective, when we say politics is back, is that the difficult choices, the trade-offs between policies have to be made by the politicians. And what we want to do is, and this is connected to the next question, is that we, the multilateral system, the ECLACs and the banks and so forth, instead of giving a long menu of public policies to the governments and then we say, guys, to do anything, do all these recipes from 1 to 100, no, we have to help them to make the difficult trade-off decisions and say, okay, if you're going to rise the tax, for example, on this front, what are you going to do on this front? Because you're going to lose here. So what I believe organizations like us, we have to confront them with the difficult trade-offs in terms of politics, social, environmental, economics. Now, you are right in terms of what you are saying, that democracies are so fragile. I think that governments have realized, or the leaders from some countries, again, some countries have realized that we are very near to a social crisis. I mean, I just come back from Mexico, no? Mexico had these big inundations and floods and so forth. People are so frustrated. And the president announced a cutback package, a fiscal package of more than $4 billion. He eliminated 3 ministries, agrarian reform, by the way, the public administration sector, and tourism. But he's making choices. That's what he's making. So I believe that our job is to go to Calderon, or to, he's making the decision right now, and probably to the Congress of Mexico, to the 3 parties, or the 3 majority parties, to talk about these issues and say, okay, would you like to build a long-term development plan for Mexico? These are the ingredients that you need. This is what you need to think about. Yesterday, one of your colleagues, Paolo, I don't know if he's here from Brazil, here you are. You said a very impressive thing yesterday, that Cardoso said that you needed 40 years of continuous policies, no? Or 6 terms of continuum policies to get Brazil out of certain crisis, problems, equality, etc. I believe the same. You need continuity on certain fronts. And this is where we have to convince society. Because, you know, the leaders don't get it sometimes. They are in a very short-term races, no? But society. So that's why we believe that the social dialogue has to come back. And here is Lázaro, and Lázaro wouldn't let me lie, that I believe that in Mexico what's happening really is that your interlocutors, where the problem is, who do you talk to? Who represents who? I mean, there is so much anarchy on the representation side in the social front. So anyway, but to come back to your question, I think that that relationship is essential To build a better quality democracy, you need continuity, and you need a society that is understanding, together with the legislative powers, that the race is not about who wins the next election. The race is about whether you are going to go towards a failed state or not, I mean, at the end of the day. Maria, I think you, I'm so glad to find you here. And yes, the green, I see a lot of opportunities on the green, on moving towards a green economy. Basically because many countries are now making very tough decisions on energy choices, for example. And they are understanding that within their energy choices, there has to go an element of green economy. Let me put you an example, Korea, which is a country that we look at because it has similar policies sometimes. Korea put together a fiscal stimulus package of $38 billion, of which 80% is devoted to green economy. We look at our stimulus packages in Latin America. We barely find green economy ideas, with one exception, Brazil. One measure, which is to reduce the taxes of the cars that consume less energy. That's the only one. One. You know what I mean? Out of almost, I don't know, 3 GDP points of investment in fiscal stimulus in our region, we found one. I mean, so we have to talk to these guys and tell them, if you're going to invest in infrastructure, believe me, that if you don't do now the changes and you start investing on coal instead of solar energy, I mean, trade is going to sanction you in the future. So that's where I see the whole thing. Now, what is going to happen with the UN? I mean, I hope you're not asking me this question in general, but I can tell you what's going to happen with the UN in climate change. But I mean, if you want a general answer, I can also give it. I mean, in terms of where is the UN becoming more relevant and more irrelevant, I think that the UN, because, well, first of all, we have to distinguish between the member states that conform the UN and the UN Secretariat. No, that's we. Or the Secretary General and so forth. Where do we get our mandates? That's the interesting thing, and that's where I see the UN in a changing mood. The Security Council, for example, the 15 members of the Security Council. If the G20 is changing, if the world went from G7, G8 to G20, the Security Council will probably have to move a step ahead to make sure that the security, because it has been demonstrated that the P5 have not been very, I would say, successful, okay, in sustaining peace in many key areas of the world. So it appears to me that the consensus to build peace, really, that is to put resources and military forces and police and whatever, might need some other members in the inner circle of peace and security. The General Assembly, I think, is a very difficult body, and the only body in the General Assembly that has teeth is the Fifth Committee, which is the one that managed the budget. That's it. Now, where is the budget going to go? That's a very key question, and let me just put you an example here. For peacekeeping operations and missions, the UN budget is $8 billion a year for peacekeeping. For the rest of the Secretariat is $4 billion every 2 years. Every 2 years. So there's no question that the emphasis of the member states in terms of where they put the money is in peace and security, is deployment, is military forces. Much less in the soft areas of the UN. We can talk about that one day, but today would be too long. But in the climate change, I believe that we have 5 things that may happen, not necessarily in Copenhagen, but between Copenhagen and Mexico, which is going to be the COP16 next year. And that is, number one, the developed countries have to really define their targets. This is extremely important. The targets of the Kyoto Protocol were defined in terms of capability. Now the targets need to be defined in terms of need. We need to cut back emissions before 2020. Why? Because if we exceed the 2 centigrade degrees, we're going to end up in a non-linear effects that nobody knows what's going to happen after that. So to cut 2% of nonlinear effects, we need to cut back emissions in a very serious way. Europe is suggesting to cut 20% by the year 2020 and use 20% of renewable energy. The U.S., everybody's looking at the U.S. to see how much is the U.S. going to come with. They said that they were going to cut back 50% by 2050, but that's the developing countries' target. Believe me. So the first question is, developed countries need to put forward their targets. The second question is, developing countries, the 12 large emitters, Brazil, India, China, Mexico, etc., Singapore, Indonesia, etc., need to put forward voluntary targets that are in real terms also going to send a very powerful message of how much emissions need to be cut. The third element has to be, what is going to be the funding mechanism for these things? Is it going to be the market? Is it going to be public funds? How are we going to end up doing these things? And the other thing is, how much is this going to be combined with transfer of technology and financing in terms of, how is this whole deal going to be in certain way coalesce? Is it going to be coalesced through a new convention, a new Kyoto Protocol? What's going to happen? Is it going to be multilateral or sub-regional? What's going to happen? So this is what is in the table for Copenhagen. And finally, in terms of the regional governance, I guess that, let me put it this way. I think our region is testing several fora. No? We go to the Americas to see Trinidad and Tobago, Obama's first time. No, okay. And the Americas have a certain agenda, the Summit of the Americas. It started with trade, now we are moving towards different sorts of cooperation. In the Ibero-American Summit, is the alliance between the region and Europe, Spain and Portugal. We explore other issues, no? But at the end of the day, there is a feeling in the region that these two, let's say, integration schemes come from abroad. They were not bottom up, there's more top down. The agenda of Europe, the agenda of Spain and Portugal, and the agenda of the US, Canada, probably Mexico, no? So, but that's the perception. Could be real, could not be real, but this is the perception. Now, what's happening in our region with the UNASURs and the Mercosurs and the whatevers, I think that the most successful integration scheme is the Central American one. I mean, I think the small countries have realized that this is important, with all the problems they have, but still they believe Central America as a region can be more strong than anything else. In the South, I think there is a tension between whether we continue with trade schemes like Mercosur, no, tariff-free schemes, or we move to other schemes that are dealing with issues so difficult like military, for example. I know everybody criticizes UNASUR, but I have to tell you something. We have done a study on UNASUR, and we can share it with you, of course. We are giving it to the Ecuadorians. They ask us to do an analysis of what does UNASUR means in terms of demographic, economic, trade, etc. So we did that, and we can, of course, share it. But the thing is that one of the things that I think we need to understand is that maybe they fight, maybe they shout to each other, but they meet to discuss the thing, you know. This military thing of the Colombian U.S. dilemmas, they sat together and they discussed it. And there's a process of negotiation going on, or at least of understanding. So I believe UNASUR is an interesting thing to watch. And in terms of the fiscal policies, just let me say that I guess that countries here are realizing that with this very low tax collection, they won't make it as a state. So even Mexico, with the crisis they are facing, like terrible crisis, the package is based on how to increase tax collection, how to avoid evasion, how to make sure that everybody pays whoever has to pay. That's the problem that I see in our region. People need to believe that the state is going to behave with transparency, with equity, and without corruption. And one government that seems to be, for me, a very good model is Chile, because President Lagos decided that he was going to focus on tax evasion. He did it. You go to Chile, and even if you buy a bubble gum, they give you a receipt, no, that shows you that this guy is paying taxes for the bubble gum you bought. But in Mexico, you go and they ask you, do you need a receipt? Hey, yes. Ask for, I mean, you see what I mean? But in Chile, the person who is selling you whatever they are selling you, if you don't take the receipt, they go out and pursue. Please take your receipt. I mean, it's just an example. But what I mean to say is that we need to realize that we need to pay. We need to pay if we want to be serious. This is what I think. And now governments are realizing, and which governments? Mauricio Funes, for example, El Salvador, he realizes that he needs a fiscal covenant. And we are talking to all the Central American countries, and they realize that this is necessary. And we are talking to South American economies, and the same. It might be that the models are different. Now, Brazil is a different case, very different, because they're already paying a lot, but the composition of the fiscal tax collection is very regressive. So there has to be a re-engineering of the thing, which is a different story. But anyway, to cut it short, I guess that, yes, we need to move progressively. And the most progressive move in Latin America is to have a serious fiscal policy. And the state should cost, we have made this calculation too, the state should not cost more than 11% of the GDP. But you do need a very serious state to make sure that other policies work.
Take a couple more questions and then.
Tanya Adams, I'm a scholar here. It's a wonderful framework you presented, but I'm wondering how you would integrate the challenge of organized crime and international drug trade into what's going to come, into that challenge.
Okay. My first one right here, too.
Yeah.
Let's make these the last two.
I'm Liza Davies from SNV Netherlands Development Corporation. We are a practitioner, and there's been a lot of academic and scholarly questions, and I want to throw in a sort of practical side. We hear a lot from donors, particularly bilateral and social investment, that economic growth is the answer. That's what they want to promote, the SME development. You can't get poverty reduction without economic growth. Yeah. Those of us who believe that economic growth without policies to ensure equality and social inclusion, there aren't a lot of sort of international means to support that kind of local work with governments. And I'm wondering, can that sort of policy development happen with an external push or external funding or external support? Like, we're a Dutch organization, we're going to come in and help a country develop some policies. Or does it have to be organic somehow within the region, with everyone really wanting to be like Chile and finding out directly from Chile what kind of policies have they been establishing, what the role of the international community can be to help support policy and politics, which in these countries is really messy and hard.
Very short is that organized crime is something that we really don't look in ECLAC, but we're going to start to look into that very shortly with other organizations in economic terms only. But I believe that the very important link, at least from our perspective, is young people, the youth. If we don't find a solution for youth is going to move to illegal trafficking. And also, I'm very worried that the organized crime now wants to get hold of the state. I mean, before they were happy with the bribes, now they want the power. So that's when we have to build something alternative, I guess. The second question related to the role of donors and whether it can come from outside and so forth. I think the countries of our region, and this is where we can help, they need to define what is their strategic development plan for the coming 5 to 10 years. Where do they want to be? What's the legacy they want? Have they thought about it? I mean, where do they want to be at the end of, 2020, 2015, 2030? Sorry to say that, but they have to think about it because those decisions have to be taken today. Do they want to be the leading edge on biotechnology, on nanotechnology? Do we want to get advantage of our biodiversity, of our energy sources? If you ask me, where do I want to be, or where do I suggest my grandchildren be in the world, I would suggest Latin America, because it's the best place to have energy sources, water, and many other things, and security. I wouldn't dare to go to other regions. We are calculating those scenarios as well. And whether you can help us from abroad, I think, of course, but the country needs to prepare their plan. When you know where you want to go, then you can accept help. When you don't know where you want to go, I mean, the external help confuse you even more. So what I believe is the governments and the countries and the people need to sit together and see, what kind of country do I want? And then what do I need from the Netherlands, from French, from the blah, 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 and then you select what you want to get. You don't get everything. You select. And let me put you one example again. I don't think the private, this is a very polemic issue, but I'm going to raise it anyway. In Chile, for example, you can go for solar energy or hydropower energy. Now, who has to define that route and that strategic approach? Well, I think the state has to define it. And then the private sector has to come in. But what's happening now is that the private sector is the one who's decided what type of energy Chile needs. I don't think so. I mean, no, of course, we're discussing with the Minister of Energy, and he's trying to build precisely this long-term approach to say, if the north of Chile is the best place to have solar energy, fine. Then you say, here we're going to have solar energy. Now, private companies all over the world, Swiss, Netherlands, everybody come, but here, solar energy, we believe this is the best place. Now, you compete, and you own it, and you developed it from a private perspective. But it's the state who has to more or less redirect what type of destiny you want for your country and your natural resources and your people. Thank you.
If in the perspective of this town, being Undersecretary at the UN, Undersecretary General for Management, is a very difficult assignment, and dealing with the Fifth Committee at the UN. Alicia has taken on a new assignment, which I think is coming at a very difficult time, but she's given us an awful lot of very good ideas to work with. We thank you for coming to the center, and we wish you well in a very critical assignment at a critical time. Thank you all for coming to the center.